There we go. They're getting too big nowadays.
Yeah, that was looking for that.
So, with our theme being victorious Christian, with our theme being victorious Christian living, I thought it would be a really good time. A really good time to propose this question: what does prosperity look like to you? Now, I can't really answer for you guys, but for myself, personally, especially in the past, what it looks like for me right now is paying for school would be wonderful, and get those debts out of the way, and being successful, traveling would be great. I really enjoy traveling. Some really good doubles, like every day. I really enjoy doubles. And let's see, maybe having enough to retire at a young, crisp 40 years old would also be great. And then taking cruises and eating all the good food on the ships and seeing beautiful skylines and sleeping without stress every single night. A boy can dream. But that's not always the case with what prosperity can look like. And God can often have different plans. So, with that being said, I would like you guys to turn your Bibles to Genesis 37:18. I'll be reading a couple of passages. One moment, please. Genesis 37:18. This is about Joseph. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. These are his brothers. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him. And we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness. Who do not lay a hand on him. That night he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of, excuse my pronunciation, Ishmaelites, coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Whew, that's a lot to take in. I can really only imagine what it's like to have your own flesh and blood quite literally sell you into slavery, into service. And it's kind of hard to imagine what might have been running through Joseph's head at this point in time. And they don't really talk about it either. That's something I find interesting that we're going to get into a bit more, into a couple more passages that I want to read. So, going on to the next one, skip ahead to Genesis 39. So, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph. This is very important. He has not left him. And he became a successful man, and he was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Even though he is going through a trial right now, the Lord is still causing him to succeed in whatever he is doing. Important to remember. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So at this point in time, things are starting to look up for Joseph, right? I'm sure he's feeling a little bit relieved, but still a bit distraught that, he's left his family, his father behind, who I'm sure is terribly worried right now. But the situation is not looking as dire as it used to be. He's in at least a decent position compared to where he was before. But then this happens. Now, Joseph was a handsome man in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" He remains faithful. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men in the house were there, she caught him by his garments, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called the men of the household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant who you brought among us came in to laugh at me." So, he's in another pickle now. For time's sake, I'll skip ahead and tell you how this ends. They throw him into prison now. So just when his situation starts to look a little bit better, and it seems as though God is sort of starting to improve his condition, now he's thrown into prison. So we move on to the next section of the story, which is in Genesis 41 now. Take it to verse 37. Joseph rises to power, that's the title. His proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" To give a little bit of context, when Joseph went into the prison, once again, they noticed that God was with him. The head of the prison guards put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. When have you ever heard that before? That somebody takes so much of a liking to a prisoner of all people and sees God in them so much that they put them in charge of other prisoners that are supposed to be on the same level. And when the king, the Pharaoh, heard of Joseph's interpretation of dreams, he started to have his own nightmares and actually pulled him out of the prison to come interpret them. And that's how we get to this point. And so Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up a hand or foot in the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh king Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second son he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Yeah. I'd like to thank you for bearing with me. I know that's a lot to take in and a lot of reading, but something that I really wanted to point out was I'm sure Joseph was extremely frustrated during this point. And even through all these passages, you actually don't see much about how he's feeling at all. And I don't necessarily understand why it was chosen to maybe leave out some of his emotions, but I'm just imagining myself in that position. I, per se, might not have the most righteous anger, if you could put it that way. I'd be very frustrated and honestly probably fed up with God, and that's a position that no one wants to be in. But Joseph stayed rather steadfast, and throughout the entire passage it said the Lord is with him. And so this is what I found interesting about this passage, and that kind of separates God from us as humans. We as people have a sort of incapability to see past what we think is trauma. So things happen in our lives, life happens, and difficult times always come about. And what we often see as difficult or traumatic, we never see the real purpose behind it. You see, our God is a very special God in that he has a knack for turning what looks like and feels like suffering and torture into a blessing, right? And that's something that's really special, because what we may see as like actual torture, it's God who actually has the envisionment, the plan for us to actually turn it into something that is a blessing. You see, I talked about before about the cruise and the money and retiring early. That's all fine and dandy and all, but what does God want? You have to stop and ask that question. You see, we have our definitions for what we think is prosperity and what we think is good, and we see the people like celebrities and public figures, and we look at them and say, I want to be like them. But God has his own definition for prosperity for us. So, going back to a little story. I talked about this a bit with the graduates as well. First semester of college was extremely rough. It was hard. It was really hard, and I'm not the only one that struggled in college, obviously, but I found myself looking up to God a lot and asking, why God? Like, why, like that, the classic, why God? And I said, I'm not seeing the fruits of my labor in this. All I'm seeing is suffering. I study for this exam, I do poorly, I try to negotiate and be patient with this professor, and they shoot me down, and everything around me just seems to be discouraging me. And then I think about 2 verses. One of them, God specifically says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So even in your times of trials, and there will be many, he says your brothers and sisters will all be suffering alongside you. So there will be many trials. He never leaves you nor forsakes you. And he also says that he has plans to prosper you. And although this might not be the prosperity that we're thinking of in terms of money and riches and wealth, it may be something simpler. Maybe he just, in a time of struggle, gives you inner peace, lets you know that he is there for you. Maybe he pulls you out of a deep hole that you didn't think was possible. Look at what happened with Joseph. Since when have you heard of a person being sold into slavery, becoming the king of one of the richest empires in history? That is something that a human cannot envision. We can never see that. Joseph was probably happy staying at home with his family, with the love of his father and his mother. But God turned him into something that is inconceivable by our measures. It's literally unheard of to watch a prisoner, his own flesh and blood, selling him into slavery, grow and become a king. And that's why he looks back, and I ended off on that verse on verse 52, the name of his second son called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. During that entire time, we know he was suffering. He probably asked why God a lot, even though the book doesn't necessarily mention it. But at the end, he looks back and says, I couldn't have even perceived this on my own. This is God. And so, to kind of close this out, I want to give a kind of a new definition for prosperity. If you want to live and prosper and live a victorious Christian life, you have to be willing to let go of what you view as success and failure. Because God made a promise to us, right? As Christians, he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you, and that I have plans to prosper you. And if you let God use you and prosper you, instead of being so set in your own afflictions, he will prosper you in a way that you will never possibly be able to conceive. Thank you.